Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Critical Reasoning. So far, we've gotten down some of the basic principles of critical thinking, like how to evaluate the structure of an argument. So that's when we evaluate whether the premises of an argument provide roughly the kind of evidence we need in order to accept the claims made in the conclusion. And we've also hopefully develop some skills, some systems for then fact checking the claims that those premises in the argument make, right? So the former, when we're evaluating structure, that's like when we were looking for things like whether an argument's valid or whether it's strong. And then the latter, when it comes to the fact checking part, we've developed some skills, sharpened our skills, developed some tools that have helped us to know when we need to go about the fact checking process, making sure that the evidence being used is actually real evidence. It's saying something about the world. So on top of learning how to evaluate arguments, we've also now looked at some of the standard ways or patterns in which or by which arguments can go wrong, right? That's what we did when we were learning about fallacies. So now we're coming into the second half of this class. And in the second half of this class, we are going to use some of those tools, skills, principles, whatever you'd like to call them, to get a better understanding of how certain behaviors, attitudes, ways of thinking, ways of talking to people that many of us in our day-to-day lives feel is like normal, and how these normalized like behaviors, ways of talking, ways of thinking, and so on end up undermining the critical reasoning process. So in the lecture video for this module period, we are going to look at how some of these like things attitudes we might consider normal, or behaviors we might consider normal, or ways of talking we might consider normal, end up ultimately excluding knowledge and or perspectives and or experiences of marginalized groups of people. So as you're going to very quickly see, these kind of normalized behaviors aren't just bad because they undermine the critical reasoning process for a lot of people on a large scale. These attitudes and behaviors or ways of talking can also inflict a lot of harm as well. All right. So first, we're going to learn a little bit about this term, epistemic oppression. Listen to a couple of podcasts about it. And that term or that concept is going to help you understand a little bit better, maybe be able to identify a little bit better instances where that kind of exclusion of knowledge, perspectives, experiences happens. And in particular, the patterns by which it happens. So it's not, as you're going to see pretty quickly, it's not just that we have one instance, say where someone's prejudice prevents them from like really hearing out another person. It's that this exists on a structural level, that there are certain behaviors, ways of talking, ways of thinking that are just so normalized that in many ways, when this happens, and it happens a lot, people don't even necessarily realize that that's what's going on, right? And this is especially dangerous when we think about, this simultaneously being something that undermines the critical reasoning process, because these kinds of normalized behaviors and things like this also or simultaneously normalize contexts in which people just stop the critical reasoning process, right? It really like undercuts it before it can get going. All right. So in the first part of this video, or the first video, we're just going to get a feel for kind of a way to broadly construct this thing that I'm talking about using this concept of epistemic oppression. So we're going to build maybe what you could think of as like a framework for analyzing specific instances where people sort of participate in these patterns of excluding experiences and like knowledge and perspectives of members of marginalized groups. And once we have that framework in place, we're going to turn our attention to a conversation. But we're going to turn our attention to where this happens specifically in conversation, and how this gets realized in what Lavelle Anderson refers to as hermeneutical impasses. So the first part of this video you can understand as giving us the framework for understanding how the critical reasoning process gets undermined in conversation and then ultimately ends up causing a lot of people a lot of harm. Okay. So you listen to a couple of podcasts about this idea of people, certain people, because of how they're positioned in society, because of their membership to an oppressed group, because they belong to an oppressed group, undercuts their ability to contribute to knowledge practices, to essentially like get other people who are not positioned in the same way that they are to come to know certain things, that because of how the people who don't experience those things don't know that stuff, and essentially being able to like let the experts have a voice in understanding like all of these different facts about the world. So that way of sort of understanding how our knowledge practices work falls into a subcategory of a larger category in philosophy, that larger category being epistemology. And then looking at like our knowledge practices in action, that falls into this subcategory of social epistemology. So before I can explain the social epistemology bit, I'm first going to explain this broader field within philosophy some of you may have heard of, this branch of philosophy called epistemology. And epistemology more general is pretty relevant to the goals of this course. So when we think of knowledge practices, right? So first and foremost, epistemology in philosophy is the study of knowledge. And as you'll see, that covers like some pretty broad territory. But one of the reasons why getting knowledge, acquiring knowledge, right, engaging in what we might call a knowledge practice is important, especially when we're thinking about critical reasoning, is that this is sort of what happens, or this is epistemologists have argued, that this is what happens when we come to believe a cogent and strong argument. So when we're presented with an argument, it gives us the kind of evidence that we need to believe the conclusion, and the premises, the propositions in the premises are true. And when we learn these things through, being exposed to these, in this case, non-deductive arguments, we come to form true beliefs. And within epistemology, we might say that such non-deductive arguments produce knowledge. And this is obviously important to the goals of this course, right? One of the goals in the course was to acquire some concepts that help us better distinguish good arguments between bad ones, right? We don't want, if we have an argument that isn't giving us the kind of evidence we need in order to believe the conclusion, right? You want to believe the conclusion on those grounds. If you remember when we were talking about fallacies and say the ad hominem fallacy, right? You don't want to believe what someone's saying simply based on evidence that the person they're attacking is, it's that time of the month. If you all remember that example, right? Like, even if the partner had a legitimate reason to say, to like push against this thing that that the person he was in the relationship was like getting upset about, right? Just because, say, like she was on her period, that doesn't mean that that was good reason to throw away what she was saying. He'd have to give, maybe that is a legitimate thing for that person to be upset about, but he'd have to give a better reason than that, right? And if he doesn't, he commits that fallacy, and ultimately so our concept, the concept that you develop there, right, is a specific way or a pattern by which you can sort of say, like, wait a second, I see an insult in this argument, right? Like somebody's like making a personal attack here. Like, I shouldn't think of that as any, I need to look, are they giving me other evidence to believe the thing they're saying is true? Because the personal attack in and of itself, like, that shouldn't be enough, right? In practice, in your day-to-day life, doing something like that, there hopefully there's a tool that you acquired in this class to help you distinguish good arguments from bad ones. And within epistemology, the way that they would describe that sort of thing, that ability to engage in that way and critically think about arguments people are making, they would say, well, like that's how you get those true beliefs about things, right? Like you can identify the good argument, the one that does give you the evidence that you need in order to believe the conclusion is true. And another piece of the course was to also learn about, and we're going to be talking about these a lot more in this module period, so learn about irrational and manipulative influences that undermine the ability to properly analyze and assess the truth, or rather the strength or quality of an argument. So we're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty details about how oppressive social practices more broadly kind of affect people's way of seeing, perceiving, interacting with other people in the world. And especially like things that are, ways of engaging with certain critiques of society, for example, perhaps like dismissing certain critiques or writing them off in some kind of way. And that being normalized is one way by which irrational and manipulative influences, right? Like if it's normal to just go, do the ad hominem attack, like I think probably a lot of you have seen in a lot of different contexts, but in particular, you see them a lot within US politics. If that's normalized, right? Like having that kind of response, and then there's just sort of this like, kind of like popular way of responding, or it's considered okay to just say like, oh yeah, that is a legitimate, if like, you can like really tear down that other person, like with that zinger, like that is a legitimate good reason to think that the thing that you're arguing against in that other, your opponent's argument is true, right? So that's sort of that represents like an irrational or manipulative force, that normalization of that kind of behavior. So yeah, we're going to be really digging in a lot to like thinking about specific kind of normalized behaviors such as that one, instances where like maybe certain comebacks are considered totally fine and okay, but ultimately they both undermine the critical reasoning process, right? They serve as these irrational or manipulative forces, that normalization that it undermines that critical reasoning process. And then specifically when it comes to epistemic oppression, we're going to be thinking about how that works in tandem with certain oppressive social practices. All right. So like I said, first, I want to give you a sense of what this branch of philosophy, epistemology, looks like more broadly. So starting off sort of epistemology 101, if you will, one of the first things that epistemologists do, or like one of the first tasks for epistemologists traditionally, is to give a definition of what actually counts as knowledge, right? Like, is it just believing something that's true? Do the reasons why you believe it factor into it? What is our criteria for saying like, okay, under these circumstances, so-and-so like believe this for this reason, and what they believed is true. Like those kinds of things would count as criteria for what counts as knowledge. So one very, very popular, there's many definitions of knowledge, just to put it out there. This is a branch of philosophy. And if you look it up on the Stanford Encyclopedia or the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, you'll see it's like a massive entry. Like people, this is like a lot of big body of work. People spilling a lot of ink over the subject for a long time. So there's a lot of different definitions out there, but one of the most sort of like well-known and discussed and thought about definitions of knowledge meets or provides the following set of criteria. So when we say that someone knows that blank, so I'm going to use the placeholders S. You can think of that S as being like someone. So it's like some random old person, any old person knows that blank. So P representing some fact. So when we say that, what we mean is, and this is according to this one specific popular definition of knowledge, that S believes that P believes that fact, is justified in believing that fact, and that fact is true. That fact's real. It's tracking something in the real world. It hits a fact of the matter, right? And according to this traditional definition of knowledge, what they say is that, so S knows that P, if and only if, not just if, but if and only if S has a justified true belief. All right, example time, right? So let's say that I believe that my keys are hanging next on the little hook next to the door, okay? And I believe that because that's exactly where I remembered putting them last night. I thought, okay, I like retraced my steps, remember when I came home and, I like pet my dog or whatever, and then I like hung my keys up because that's what I do every single time. And I distinctly remembered doing that last night because I stubbed my toe on the chair next to the hook, like when I was like leaning over, and that hurts. I have like a very specific memory of that happening last night. And so there's my justification, and my keys are actually hanging on the hook next to the door. So under this imaginary, so provided all of these things, right? Like this is essentially evidence. Each line 1, 2, and 3 serve as evidence of me meeting the criteria for what counts as knowledge. So in order for me to say, or for anyone to say, Leah knows that her keys are hanging next to her front door, right? I have to believe it. I have to have some kind of justification for believing it. Like I was talking about stubbing my toe, it's a thing I do all the time, and that it's actually true, all right? So this is the kind of work that philosophers traditionally do when it comes to analyzing knowledge. A little bit smaller. All right. So one thing that was talked about in both the podcasts, in the podcast that you listened to, was that there is a very important way or space or aspect of like, let me reframe that. Sure, epistemology, that criteria I was showing you, examining like what really counts as knowledge, like that can be good and important work. One thing all that work doesn't tell us is how that knowledge, or what that knowledge production looks like in practice, like in action, right? Like the thing I was saying a little bit ago. So one way to sort of see how epistemology, traditional epistemology, falls short in this way is to think about, all right, great, I will give you, Leah knows all the stuff about the thing and has a justification for it, and the thing is there, and like, awesome, great, right? But what does that matter if there's no one there to believe it? Or what does any of those good reasons, rather, those What does any of the potential for someone to know certain things matter, right? If no one believes it. So let me reframe that. Restate what I just the point I was trying to make. So say that my keys are hanging next to the front door, and say that, I had the memory, stubbing my toe, all of that stuff, like that sort of thing. But if I don't if I don't believe that, right? What does it matter? So the point that's being made there is that we can have all the facts about the matter, and we can have all the conditions under which somebody would have a justified belief about those facts. But that doesn't tell us anything about the process by which we come to believe those things. And, given number one criteria is that, Leah believes the keys are next to the door, right? Like, I believe that. We're going to want to dig in a little bit more about what that looks like within epistemology. We want to look at, on a social level, what knowledge production looks like, what kinds of practices might guide it, what kinds of things might inhibit it. And that's where social epistemology comes in. So social epistemology is looking at that first step, that coming to believe step, the things in our society that guide those processes, that give rise to knowledge practices. And social epistemology asks questions like, what do we need to gain a full and robust understanding of our social world, right? So what do we need in order to form those justified true beliefs about all of those facts that exist out there? What do we need in order to form beliefs, say, about, like my keys hanging next to the door? That's easy enough, right? Like, there's like certain things that we experience in our day-to-day life, like with respect to our own experiences. Okay. But when it comes to gaining a full and robust understanding of the world, that's knowledge, right? Like, those are going to be justified true beliefs, maybe, that concern things that go beyond things that we experience. So things like, how do we learn about, whatever your major is, right? Like, how do we learn about psychology or English or science or business administration, right? Things that, the reason why, I think pretty much all of you are here, things that you don't readily, facts, information, that sort of thing, that it's not a part of your day-to-day life. You're not going to get it unless you go to a place to learn about it, right? Like a university, like a college, an institution like this one, like Lehman. We engage here in knowledge practices, producing knowledge, right? This is an aspect of our society that works to produce knowledge in students. And without that, in a lot of ways, not always, most certainly not always, but for, I think like a lot of this is true in like aspects of at least some of your education, stuff that you're not just going to learn on your own in your day-to-day life. Like, you need a classroom, you need a place to go, you need a knowledge practice to produce that knowledge in you. Another question that social epistemologists ask is how knowledge gets produced, right? So I was kind of touching on that a second ago when I was talking about, like, one example would be coming to a university like Lehman, having a place to produce knowledge about certain fields, certain professions, certain careers, things like that. And it's also a place where we share knowledge, right? Like me, hopefully sharing some knowledge with you, and most certainly you all sharing knowledge with me. Giving philosophy is a place where a lot of that back and forth definitely happens. Sometimes it's more one-sided. So Lehman is like an example of how knowledge gets produced. And social epistemology wants to oftentimes looks at not obviously just single examples, but other ways in which knowledge gets produced. Because I'm guessing if I this was an in-person class, and I just started randomly calling on people and going like, hey, tell me what a knowledge practice is, right? Like you might sit there and be like, after I gave the example of Lehman, you might be like, like school. Okay, great. Think of another knowledge practice. It's not immediately, it may not be immediately obvious. And that's kind of the point that I'm trying to make here is part of the work within social epistemology is really looking into places and identifying where knowledge practices are happening. Because this knowledge production thing is a very diverse sort of phenomena. And trying to see where it's happening, trying to identify it requires a lot of attention, and it's going to be pretty complicated. We're not it's not immediately obvious, rather, how many things in our lives count as knowledge practice. So part of the task within social epistemology is identifying all these things that we might not typically think of as a knowledge practice, and then seeing, how knowledge gets produced in those contexts, recognizing when knowledge gets produced in those contexts. And perhaps lastly, and most importantly, and this is something that Brianna Toole talked a lot about, social epistemologists, a big important question for them is this question of who gets to share knowledge, or another way of framing that is who gets to participate in knowledge production, right? So for instance, I'm sure that everybody here could think of a class that they took at, Lehman or in high school where the knowledge production was very one-sided, right? Where the teacher is just lecturing at you, like this is the information, you need to get it. And, for certain contexts, I'm not criticizing that, but in those experiences, yes, you at the very least you were participating in terms of like receiving some knowledge there, but the teacher, the professor, was the one who was in the position perhaps to really produce knowledge in other people. Now, in order for, and this is I think something that traditional epistemology, like, it just by the nature of how it works, it's going to overlook. But it really, because it doesn't first take a step and look at this, this idea of, producing a belief, like what happens on a social level in terms of producing the belief. This question of being recognized as somebody who knows something, social epistemology and other contexts, might call that person a knower, right? Getting recognized as somebody who has like some good knowledge to share, right? Can get that information out there. Because like I was saying, there's going to be some experiences that we're familiar with just in our day-to-day life. So things like where my keys are right now, for example, like I have access to that knowledge. But there's going to be other things that I perhaps don't know about just because of like my day-to-day experiences. For example, because of, where I live and things like this. I don't have a whole lot of experience having to drive for a really long commute, right? Like definitely have some long commutes on the train, but not a whole lot of experience, navigating like rush hour traffic, like that whole world, or life, working in an office where I have like a cubicle and am in a sort of corporate environment, right? So those experiences, those kinds of things, like there are a bunch of little like nuggets, facts, information about things about the world that I'm not going to know about simply because, I'm not in a position to know them. And, say I meet somebody who like, that is the kind of life that they lead, right? Maybe there's things that they know about like good tricks for staying awake, like while you're having to drive, or how to kind of like manage emotions around road rage, things like this, right? Like they might have all this really great knowledge, but if I don't think of them as a knower, like I might, maybe I think like that, I'm not going to trust any of the ways that like they navigate, like say maybe some anger problems surrounding road rage, because I like have seen this person like get upset in a lot of other contexts and not handled it well, right? So if they're trying to give me, even if they're in a position where they do actually have some knowledge and experience because they're like dealing with that rush hour traffic and they might have some like useful information, good, real fact of the matter information about some like good tools for navigating and sort of like not getting yourself to the point where you're experiencing road rage, because I don't really maybe trust them in other aspects. I'm not going to say listen to them if they're trying to tell me about some like useful like tactics for like calming down your road rage, right? I don't see them as a knower, despite the fact that like they might be in a position to really know some things, share some knowledge, tell me some true facts about the world. And if we tie all this stuff back to the other first two questions, right? So the first two questions here. What we're gonna start thinking about, like especially, so we're looking for things that really count as knowledge practices. Like there's that exchange of information where like people are putting out those facts of the matter, you know, things about the world, right? And we want to know those things because it's good to know things about the world, especially in society where like things we do affect other people, right? And especially because we can't be in everybody's shoes all the time. So there's going to be people that are in certain positions to know things that we want to know, say like a professor or a teacher at school. We're going to want to receive that. We're going to want to engage in those knowledge practices. And we want to look at the, you know, the situations under which like people are receiving of that information and so on. We're really going to, when we start looking at that, and we start looking especially at the instances where that kind of information exchange, that recognition of like the right kind of knowers, that sort of thing, gaining that full, robust understanding of the world, we're going to see that in looking at those successful instances, knowledge gets produced in people, you know, those facts are getting out there. We're going to start to notice that there are people that we should be listening to that we're not. And that inhibits or undermines this ultimate goal, hopefully, that we have, because we live in a society and our actions affect other people and all that stuff, of gaining this full and robust understanding of our social world. Okay, so this is where, when this, you know, so got a little sense of like what it's like, you know, that some of the stuff that social or that traditional epistemology doesn't necessarily answer, some of the questions, right, that social epistemologists look at in terms of knowledge production, and in particular, you know, who gets to produce knowledge in other people, and importantly, recognition of this, you know, like the goal here is for us to have a full and robust understanding of our social world. And what we are going to notice pretty quickly is that there are groups of people that get left out. The good, successful instances are all fine and good, but there's sort of gaps in a more like on a population level sort of understanding of certain things about our social world. Because when we think about our social world, right, we are thinking about how society is structured. And we're thinking about, you know, like the consequences of certain government policies, right? Like anywhere from like a Supreme Court ruling to choices that, you know, New York State governor is making about funding at CUNY and how that affects your tuition rates, right? And if we want to really, or rather, when we, one of a big place where we see very problematic gaps in knowledge align with what we might call oppressive social practices, right? Okay, so I would think that every single person in this class has heard this term oppression. Maybe some of you have like thought about a definition of it. Maybe some of you just feel like it's a I know it when I see it kind of thing, or something like this. And within philosophy, kind of in the same way that, you know, like there are a lot of different ways that people define knowledge, because it's like this like really big important thing, right, in our, and so it's like it's not going to be necessarily a quick and easy answer. a sort of similar thing is like happened with oppression. There's a lot of different, there's a lot of, if we want to give like one big clear definition of it, that ends up being like a really tricky task because it is such a diverse phenomena. So one way that some philosophers have sort of responded to this problem, giving like this big old blanket definition of knowledge, is just being like, okay, let's just try to identify. We're not going to want to say what every single instance of oppression has. Like, we're not going to want to go the route of like, it has to be a justified true belief kind of criteria. What we can do instead is just say, okay, let's see if we can identify one shared aspect of all of these different things that might fall under this umbrella of this term oppression. And then from there, we can start to look at that stuff. So like, and that first question that you can look at is whether someone, because of their membership to a marginalized group, right? Because of like maybe like prejudices against like someone's skin color or their gender, their orientation, disability, and so on. Because of that, oftentimes these are like extraneous features, like visual things that you can see visually, but there's definitely other like marginalized identities where like it's not visually apparent. So like somebody's sexuality, for instance. But generally those things, like those aspects, somebody who has one or more of shares in one or more of those identities, by virtue of that identity, of that membership to this group of people, they find themselves in situations where there are just simply no good options available. Okay. So I know the thing that I just explained is pretty abstract, and then some of you might be like, okay, I have absolutely no idea what Leah is talking about. And yeah, so in response to that, I feel like examples are always helpful. So you can imagine a situation where you have, say, a woman at work, and there are, and like, say, like her manager, straight guy, has been hitting on her a lot, right? Like, I would think that like this is a familiar, right? Like, just take your like any story that you've heard about like sexual harassment in the workplace between like a guy who's like sexually harassing like a woman that like is his subordinate, like works under him, he has like some control over, right? So on the one hand, right, like this woman is like having to go to work, this guy's making her uncomfortable, and having to sign up for that, show up for that every single day, bear it, right? Like that sucks. But on the other, this isn't true of every single situation by any means, but I think a lot of times people in these kinds of positions feel like they can't say anything because there's going to be some kind of backlash. Like if you go over the manager's head and like talk to the general manager or something like this, saying like, hey, so-and-so's been like, like trying to push me to like go out on a date and always talking about my clothes and how pretty I look and like touching my arm, and it makes me really uncomfortable, right? Like if for a lot of people, that kind of, approaching things in that way to like get this stressful, bad situation to stop, feel like it's too risky, right? Because they might get fired, lose their job, get a worse schedule, some kind of retaliation for calling out this bad behavior, let alone, talking directly to that person, like the kind of feeling a lot of trepidation, feeling it's very risky to say to like that manager, like, hey, can you like not touch me or talk about my clothes or something like this, right? So just because that person is a woman, right? Like kind of like being approached in this way, like handled in this way. And it's not to say that this doesn't work the other way around, because it most certainly does. But under these particular circumstances, I think it's reasonable enough for you to at least like be like, yeah, this is a thing that happens pretty regularly, right, between men and women. And it's like because the guy like feels comfortable, engaging with a woman that who works under him in that way, right? And that, because of her gender, that level of comfort felt with like, pushing, commenting, touching, like in that way. Puts her, the employee, in a position where she doesn't have a whole lot of good options available, right? Either keep gritting and bearing it and putting up with it and trying to smile it off and like be as like, keep some distance, maybe like make sure not to be alone with that person or something like that at any given point. Pretty not good option. Or try to call it out, talk to the manager about it, talk to the manager's boss about it, and like risk some serious retaliation, like rock in a hard place, right? No good options available. So it's this sort of thing. And in particular, because part of us imagining this, or why one of the reasons why it's so easy to imagine, is because it's such a familiar thing, and it's such a familiar thing that happens to women. And again, I want to reiterate that like there are a lot of different kinds of sexual harassment that are rooted in like other kinds. It's not just misogyny regarding women. Like there's a lot of other different situations we could sort of like imagine, like maybe like there's some kind of like economic disparity, and then also additionally like power imbalances in and of themselves can be ripe for exploitation. But like in particular, like this story about women experiencing sexual harassment in the workplace, it's something that it happens, it's a pattern, right? Like it's a familiar thing. Like we're familiar enough with hearing this sort of story, right? Where because of an aspect, because of some identity that a person has that kind of makes them vulnerable in society, they end up finding themselves sort of predictably in situations where they don't have a whole lot of good options available, right? And so what social epistemologists do with respect to this question of oppression and how it connects with our knowledge practices is they look at how that kind of rock in a hard place props up within a knowledge practice. Okay. So in the podcast, the interview with Christy Dotson, the person that coined this term for the most part, epistemic oppression, she brings up this example of her friend who is a law professor and a Black woman, and her experience where she was going shopping, experienced some anti-Black racism, and then went back to her colleagues to share this experience with them, right? So in that story, Dotson was saying how her friend had this experience of going to a store, right? It was Christmas time and she wanted to go shopping in the store. The doors were closed and there were people in the store, and the door was locked, and she tried to get in, and the people in the store just kind of, like gave her this dumb, like, oh, I guess I don't know what to do about this. And so what her friend was saying is that she has this experience, and immediately she knows, she's like, they didn't want to let me in the store because I'm Black, right? Like there was like, she felt that. She like knew those looks, right? She was familiar with it because of her own lived experiences. So she goes back to work at her university, and she's, telling this experience to a group of white colleagues. And the response that she was given wasn't, oh, wow, that really sucks, right? Like the automatic response from all these people she was trying to tell this to is that she somehow misunderstood or misinterpreted the employees in the store, the people in the store, like what their reaction to her was. Like she was saying, like it was obvious to her, there were other people in the store, other customers in the store, and yet they didn't let me in. The door was locked, right? And then one of like colleagues would respond, well, like, no, maybe they were all employees and they were doing inventory or whatever. And then being like, no, it was like the middle of the day, right when, like I know this thing, like I'm familiar with this thing. And, here we have a group of people who are not in a position, because of the color of their skin, to know what it's like to experience anti-Black racism. And so here they are, they're presented with a person who clearly is positioned to share knowledge of those kinds of experiences, right? Like an expert on what on her experiences of anti-Black racism. And there was something that prevented them from taking that fact, right? like producing knowledge in them. Like here she's like holding facts, like here are some facts about the world, here are some things that you can believe that will give you a fuller and more robust understanding of, our social world. And the people are like, no, I don't want it, right? So she wasn't regarded, seen, recognized as a knower, and was prevented from participating in knowledge production and a knowledge practice concerning the experiences of like diverse experiences, but just experiences of anti-Black racism. And the reason why we recognize this as something that also links up or works in tandem, exclusion from that knowledge practice, links up with oppression, is that Chrissy Johnson's friend found herself or rather between a rock and a hard place, right? It's like, well, so then, you share this experience with people and they kind of like throw it out, reject it, double it down, call them out for being wrong about it, which, runs the risk of them saying like, oh, what are you saying? Like I'm racist. What do like we're friends, blah, blah, blah. I can't be racist, that sort of thing, or lets it slide, doesn't push back, doesn't try to like push through that kind of like willful ignorance happening on her colleague's part because of the risk it takes or the risk that is involved with it. And it's just, like not worth the battle, but then doesn't inform and help her colleagues understand, like an important aspect of our social world that we all live in. Specifically, like the kinds of experiences she has as a Black woman, and her own experiences of oppression, right? Kind of like I was saying in the very beginning when we were talking about oppression, it's this big old wide thing, like it's really hard to give like a full explanation, like a unified, clean, clear account with, all that criteria of like this counting as oppression. The best way, and we know it's a fact about the world, the social world that we live in. So the thing in there is, if it's really hard to get like a big, clear, zoomed out picture of what this big concept of oppression is. At the very least, if we want to gain a fuller and more robust understanding of our social world where oppression is playing a big role in it, right? The very least that we should do is try to listen to individual experiences. That's like one like method by which we could come and gain a fuller, better, more robust understanding of our social world. And exclusion, this automatic like knee-jerk, like even though she's the one in the position to know what she's talking about, it was her experiences, right? Her colleagues have never had any experiences like that. They still pushed against it. They refused to recognize her status as a knower and excluded her from producing knowledge in them that would help produce a fuller and more robust understanding of the social world that we live in. So, like I was kind of saying earlier, when it comes to, there are going to be specific instances under sort of like one-off instances under which these sorts of things happen. But the thing about epistemic oppression and, various oppressive social practices is that they exist as patterns, right? Like when I was giving an example of sexual harassment, like we know that pattern, it's a familiar thing. And so the place where we see patterns when it comes to specifically the exclusion of certain people from participation in a knowledge practice is a pattern where there is that refusal to, even though that person is 100% like, it totally makes sense for them to be recognized as a knower under the circumstances, right? There's a thing that happens. There's like a resistance, like, nope, I don't want to hear it. Sort of like, I mean, I would think that, and oftentimes like that kind of like, oh, want to turn a blind eye sort of thing that happens. It's like kind of a part of our psychology, how we like deal with like conflicting information, in a way that doesn't always sort of constitute participating in an oppressive social practice. Like I would think that everybody here could imagine at least one example where they turned a blind eye to something, right? And you can look back on it and you can go, I knew that it wasn't this way, or like I knew that I shouldn't be friends with this person, or I shouldn't date this person, or that this person shouldn't have I shouldn't have like trusted them to do this thing, or this job wasn't going to be a good fit, right? Like these like times you can look back on and be like, I knew it, but I just like I didn't want to look at it, right? It's that kind of, I guess you could say, like a psychological experience that we're talking about here when we're talking about the behavior that I just described in the colleagues, in the Christmas shopping example, where it's like they knew it, there's all the good, but they just like still, nope, not gonna recognize this person as a knower, and like, pick up those facts about the world that like are good for me to know and pick up. And when we, and that you can, so that sort of behavior contributes to an oppressive social practice in the sense that it happens as a pattern. It's like a reliable sort of like going in, being like bracing yourself, saying like, all right, so I'm, I like feeling like in all likelihood, if I try to like share this experience, like it's probably going to get shut down, because of the color of my skin or my gender, or so on. And when we zoom out a little bit, what we find with these patterns is that there are certain people in certain contexts that are just consistently kept out of knowledge communities, of different kinds of knowledge practices. And as a result, right, it's sort of like a systematic exclusion of certain viewpoints, experiences, knowledge, like I was saying in the very beginning of the video. We miss out. We don't understand. We don't gain that fuller and more robust understanding of the social world we live in, sort of keeping blinders on and maintaining a kind of like ignorance, or upholding false beliefs that we have about the world. And if the goal is to know things about the world, then when we have this on a widespread scale, we're not going to we're not gonna get there. We're not gonna, if we have like a pattern of certain people, trying to like, here you go, like here are the like facts about the world, and then there's just these patterns by which people go like, nope, because of this thing about you, because of your sexuality, because of your disability, and so on. We're gonna like, you don't get a count here. Like we're not gonna see you in that expert light. That really undercuts, like we're excluding like a big and important part of certain realities about the social world that we live in. So just quickly, how this, or rather now, welcome to your extra credit portion of the lecture video. So this here, just so you can like see everything. This extra credit is going to be due if you want to get that extra credit, those extra credit points. This will be worth up to 3 points extra credit, and you have to get it to me by Sunday, the 6th, via email. So don't tack it on to your any assignments you submit on Blackboard. If you want to submit this and get extra credit, you have to submit it to me via email. And if you decide to do this, what you need to do is give me a definition of epistemic oppression. You're going to want to think about some of the stuff I talked about here, but those podcasts that you listen to, in particular, the one with Christy Dotson, the Unmute podcast, very important. And then give 2 examples of it, right? So you're going to have to give 2 examples of somebody who is excluded from a knowledge, from knowledge production, because of their identity, and that ends up putting them between a rock and a hard place. And then I want you to just write a little bit about why you think epistemic oppression prevents people from gaining a full and robust understanding of the world. I definitely talked about this a lot. So this is a place where you can, if you want to talk about some of the things I talked about, great. If you want to just sort of go into some of the stuff that has come up for you in listening to this, you're more than welcome to do so. Okay. So that's going to be it for the first part of the lecture video. And in the next lecture video, we're going to start to look at how epistemic oppression functions in conversation. All right. Thanks, everyone, and see you next time.